All right, plenty to dive into. Johnny Mac is in the house. Break up with your bookie. Harrah's Resort and Bally's Atlantic City Wild Wild West are now taking bets at their new sports books. Wager today at the book. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. Let's bring John into the conversation, as we now know, John, that it will be Nick Foles who will play on Thursday night. But will it only be Thursday night? It sounded like, and I know you were one of them, who thought that Nick would be ready to go, or Carson would be ready to go. That's not going to be the case. But is this going to be a longer-term situation than maybe even you thought?
Yeah, well, certainly it's going to be longer than I thought, because I thought he was going to be out there week one. A lot of people did. I think Carson's disappointed he didn't clear that hurdle. Nick's going to start. And I wrote about it on 973ESPN.com. I get the sort of feeling there's been a little bit of change in the Eagles' philosophy through this entire process. It was when Carson is cleared, Carson will play. And now you see a little hedging on that. And I think it started when John Clark got to talk to Carson's surgeon, which was not a coincidence. That was obviously set up by the Eagles, and he sort of talked about having a more cautious approach. And he talked about, and he used the language, this is about the next 12 to 15 months. And then you see the Ian Rappaport report that Doug Pederson got so upset about, using that same language. So I think there's been a change, and I think they're hedging, and they're saying this is a very serious injury. This is more than an ACL tear. He could play, as Dr. David Chow said, probably week one, but he would be limited to being sort of a pocket quarterback. And then you start talking about the typical timeline of these types of injuries. And when you're talking about when is he going to be 100% Carson Wentz from what he was before, well, most doctors say that takes 12 months. 12 months is December 13th. So before the Eagles were intent on putting him back on the field when he was cleared, now I think they're starting to think in another direction, and maybe even going to the fact that if Nick Foles plays well, we can buy another week, buy another week, buy another week. I will say this. If the Eagles didn't have Nick Foles, I think Carson Wentz would be the starting quarterback right now.
Really?
Yeah. I think they're playing it cautious because they have Nick Foles and that insurance policy and that luxury.
So that kind of throws out the thought, though, that they would not push him out there if he wasn't ready. But if they didn't have a good enough insurance plan, that might go out the window?
Exactly. I think if you don't have a good enough insurance plan, you start getting desperate. And then you start talking about the fact that, as I said, the timeline's 9 months. Now, if you're going to play it hard against that timeline, 9 months is technically September 13th. So, yeah, maybe you hold him out for the first game, play him the second game after the long rest. I could see that. But from every doctor I've talked to, and I talked to 3 independent surgeons, there's not going to be much difference between 9 months to 12 months when you're talking about the healing. What surgeons always point to is the statistics of a re-tear, of a re-injury, and that dramatically decreases once you hit the 12-month period. But I can't imagine the Eagles would keep him out that long.
John, so you're basically saying this Pederson decision is him putting his foot down and saying, I need a direction. I want to know. I want everyone to know now who's under center. It has nothing to do with Wentz not being able to play or not being cleared.
No, he hasn't been cleared, and I think that is to protect the coaching staff, not just Doug, but the coaching staff as a whole. The Eagles medical staff has not cleared him. And as long as he's not cleared, you can't blame it on the coach. You can't blame it on anybody else. It's a medical decision, and we don't get to talk to the medical doctor. So all we can talk to is sort of independent surgeons that do the same thing to other athletes in other sports and ask them what they think. And the caveat is they always say they haven't examined him. They can only give a broad spectrum of what happens typically. And then you add on to the fact that Carson, by everyone's estimation, has been ahead of schedule. Nobody expected him to be out there going all the way back to OTAs. We didn't expect to see him at all. From the first OTA, he was working on the field. He never missed a training camp practice, not one. And we look at this roster, think about how many players have missed training camp practices. He was scaled back from team drills, but he was out there every day working during individual drills, 7-on-7s, never even missed a practice. So if you look at it, and from that perspective, you say to yourself, well, what changed? And the only thing I can come up with is the caution and the fact that they're having second thoughts and they're concerned. You look at a Robert Griffin III, and when he got back on the field with a similar injury, obviously it did not go well for him. Other people have done it. Remember, Carson Palmer did it, was injured later than Carson Wentz. Adrian Pederson, during his MVP year, was injured later, came back and won the MVP. So it's not like he would have been the first to do this. So to me, it points towards caution, and that was something the Eagles said didn't enter into it. They said before this, when he's cleared, he's cleared. I don't know if that's not necessarily the case now, and even Doug Pederson admitted when he got asked today, what do you need to see from Carson? And he wouldn't talk about it, but he wouldn't say any longer when he's cleared, he's cleared. So now you start to think, well, does he need a full week of practice? Does he need 2 full weeks of practice? We don't know that yet.
If he's not ready for clear for contact when Friday came around, when Doug apparently was told, hey, look, he's still not ready, do you think that they were surprised to hear the information they got from the doctor on that Friday?
Well, the other speculation I've heard, and I guess you could give it some, it's potentially true, is that Doug was obviously very frustrated at the offensive struggles in the preseason. I think there's a lot of context you put into that, and the fact that a lot of guys didn't play, starting with Carson, but people like Jason Peters, Darren Sproles held out. Nelson Aguilar, when he got injured, Alshon Jeffrey obviously hasn't been out there. A lot of important pieces to that offense weren't on the field. But even when you put that context on it, Nick did not play well. He just did not. He did not look good. And then you start from a coach's perspective. If you think you're going to have your star quarterback week 1 and all of a sudden you're told you can't have him week 1, well, that could have caused the frustration, certainly. So you have to throw that into the mix as well.
John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN.com. You look at the situation with obviously Nick Foles moving forward. The next question that I've gotten many times already today, which is, what if Nick plays well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a legitimate question. I don't know, and I don't know how you bench quarterbacks in this league when they win. So if you're talking about a 2-0 start, are you really going to bench him in week 3? You almost have to wait for a loss. Now, ultimately, look, Nick is what Nick is. We talk about it a lot. His sort of resume is like the EKG of a heart attack victim. It's just spikes all over the place. He's great, and then he's awful. And that's just been Nick Foles throughout his career. I mean, I joke about it. He's got more stuff in the Hall of Fame than Hall of Fame quarterbacks. When you talk about his jerseys and cleats from the 27-2 season and the 7-touchdown game and the Philly special and all the Super Bowl stuff, he literally has more artifacts in the Hall of Fame than Hall of Fame quarterbacks. But everybody knows he's not a Hall of Fame quarterback because the one thing that tends to define those guys is consistency from week to week. And as I always describe Nick Foles, he's a straight shooter. That's what he is. One week he's going to score 40, and the other week he's going to go 2 for 20 shooting the ball. There's just no consistency. So at some point he's going to lose a football game, and then the door is open for you.
Yeah, and I know he was asked about how Carson took it, and then he found out, how he found out and all this stuff. I mean, do you think Pederson just got to the point where this was a losing battle for him? Because he delivered this news yesterday when he was not scheduled to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going on with Doug. I wrote about it. I think he's trying to create a new narrative. Last year was the underdog when Carson got hurt. He can't use underdog now. So I think he's trying to create this us versus them environment. And it works because nobody likes the media, and that's just the reality of it. And they criticize us for asking questions about the starting quarterback of the Super Bowl champions before Week 1. I mean, what the heck are we supposed to do? That's if you don't nail that down, you're not doing your job. But the reality is that he won a Super Bowl. He's got a lot of money in the bank, so to speak, and he can do what he wants. And I think he's trying to create that us versus them narrative, and I think that was part of it. And a little part of it was frustration because he's been answering these questions since the spring. But I got news for you. They're still not going away. Now it's just changed to when is he going to be back? Not is he, when. So it's the same thing.
John, are you concerned or at least surprised in a negative way about how Doug Pederson has handled this question throughout the last 2 or 3 weeks? I mean, you just said it yourself. He came out with a plan, and then he went the other way with it. He snapped multiple times when asked this question. Is there anything to look into with all of this stuff?
No, not really. I mean, I always say if you compare Doug to most coaches, I mean, he's more agreeable than most. He's nicer than most. He's more accommodating than most. So, I think people a lot of times we as reporters will write sort of snarky things on Twitter or social media, and people will take them seriously. Like, we don't like Doug Pederson, and nothing could be further than the truth. As I wrote, behind the scenes, he's a nice man. As I said, he's accommodating. Nobody has an issue with him. I think people did have an issue when he lumped us all together because we're not the same, and everybody is different. And nobody in that room reported Nick Foles as the starter because it was leaked to the NFL Network. And that's just business in the NFL. The NFL literally encourages their teams to leak information to the league's own sources. Ian Rappaport's an NFL employee. So, I mean, if you want to yell at somebody, yell at the NFL. So that was from the perspective of the media, but nobody has an issue with Doug Pederson. He can do what he wants, and if he doesn't want to answer the question, he doesn't have to answer the question. But the questions are going to be asked.
How do they move forward now with Wentz in terms of typically the starter gets all the snaps? So how do they work Wentz to kind of keep him sharp?
Yeah, that's difficult because you're right. I mean, when you get in the regular season mode, there's very few reps to go around the backup quarterbacks, and he's not even a backup at this point because he's not going to dress. The backup's going to be Nate Sudfeld. So he mentioned some service team reps, working off to the side. I think the biggest hurdle the Eagles have is just the competitive nature of Carson Wentz because he's going to be chomping at the bit to get back in there. And as I said, I think they're holding him back now. I think they're being cautious. And I think that's the greatest hurdle. I mean, you can say it and you can think it's logical, but this guy wants to be on the field, and he's worked as you-know-what off to get on the field, and now he's not being permitted to be on the field. We talk a lot about the personalities of Carson Wentz and Nick Foles, and for the most part, they're not going to clash. They're not going to undermine each other. There's no question about that. But, man, Carson wants to play.
Yeah.
If you keep pushing it back, at some point it's going to become an issue to him.
Boy, interesting, because at this stage now, you're in a spot where you're playing Friday, and then you don't play again for 10 days. So the questions seemingly are going to come right back, right?
Oh, sure. I mean, the questions are going to be there until one of two things. The Eagles put a definitive timeline on it and flat out say, well, we're going to hold them out until this point, or if they continue down the road they are, it's going to be every week. Is this the week Carson's back? Has he been cleared for contact? Why not? So it's up to the Eagles. They can control the narrative, and they can handle it any way they want. I don't think they've handled it very well to this point, to be honest, but we'll see if it changes from here.
Let's look at a couple things real fast, because this is the first time we've been on the air since '53. Any surprises to you?
Well, the biggest surprise, not big names, but Stephen Means. I was in charge of sort of the beat writers roster pool, and I think there were 16 people in it this year. Every single one of them had Stephen Means on the roster. So, 16 for 16. People thought he was going to make this football team. And again, he's not a big name, but the way this team talks about him behind the scenes, what he impacts as far as his work ethic, his energy, that was a surprise to everybody. But as far as major contributors, there certainly were no surprises, nor were there expected to be.
You also have the situation at wide receiver. Jeffrey looks like Holland, so they brought Wheaton back. What is the wide receiver position going to look like Thursday night?
Yeah, it's not looking great early in the season, no question. I mean, if all of a sudden, not only when Alshon Jeffrey's not out there, understand it's more than losing your top wide receiver, but then all of a sudden Nelson Aguilar's got to play more outside the numbers. Remember, he was not effective doing that. His first two seasons became sort of a burgeoning star as a slot receiver. You kind of need him outside because you can't count on the Shelton Gibsons and the DeAndre Carters of the world just yet. That's why they brought back Marcus Wheaton. I think you're going to see a lot of 12 personnel against the Falcons, 2 tight ends. I think you're going to see Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert together early. Darren Sproles out of the backfield. I think you got to go about it offensively in different ways because it hurts not having Alshon Jeffrey out there early in the season. He's probably at least not going to be out there for the first 2 weeks.
Another thing you've got with the wide receivers, there hasn't been a whole heck of a lot of work between these guys, and I guess that's the problem. The running back situation, too. You haven't had Ajayi doing a whole heck of a lot, so how do you anticipate the running backs being divvied up in this opener? Do you think they're going to go full force with Ajayi, or is that not going to be really the plan for the whole year?
No, I mean, ever since Doug has been here, it's been a committee approach. I think that will continue for a number of reasons. One, Jay just has issues with his knee, chronic issues, so he needs to be on a pitch count to begin with. Then you have Corey Clement, who this team is very high on, and then you have Darren Sproles. I always talk about, you can go back to Doug's first year and the first 2 games, plus before Darren was hurt last year, in key situations, late in games when the game was on the line, Darren Sproles was the running back he always went to. So I think that's going to be the same, and you're going to have a committee, and it's going to be those 3 guys. But Jay is the lead back. He's going to get the most carries. It's not going to be sort of 25, and then Corey Clement spells them for 4 or 5, and Darren Sproles plays on third down. It's going to be maybe Jay Ajayi getting 15 carries, maybe Corey Clement getting 8 or 9, and Darren doing the rest of the work. And if somebody gets hot on a particular weekend, he might go to them more.
John, the Eagles bring in Rodgers at tight end, the only true blocking tight end. He's now on IR for the first 8 weeks. Talk about the impact there.
Yeah, that hurts. You're right. He's their only blocking tight end, and he's gone. And they signed Marcus Wheaton because they needed help at receiver. Ultimately, I think they're going to have to bring in another body at tight end Josh Perkins is now the third tight end, but he's a 230-pound guy. He's another receiver type. So you have Ertz. You heard what Michael Kendricks said about Zach Ertz. Blocking is not his forte. Let's be honest. Dallas Goedert never asked to block in college. Your hope, because Dallas is so big and he showed a willingness to block in the preseason, that he could pick it up quickly. But again, he's never really done it all that much.
They could probably make Mailata a tight end for a couple of games.
Well,
he'll be in the Hall of Fame.
Isaac, and you laugh, but Isaac Seumalo is sort of that third tight end in sort of goal line and short yardage situations. So they will bring in Isaac if they need a blocker at times. But that's difficult to do sort of in the middle of the field, middle of the game, to have him. You're tipping off what you're going to do. Obviously, he's not going to catch the football, but he will be used as a blocker at times.
Yeah, and while we're on the topic of Mailata, I mean, has Canton reserved a spot for him?
Well, we're up to Baldy and Ross Tucker. Yeah, I mean, I feel sorry for the kid when I hear those comparisons. I mean, Brian brought up Joe Thomas, who's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. Ross Tucker called him Jason Peters Jr. I mean, the guy's the 53rd guy on the roster. He's not going to. Right? He's not going to dress.
If Peters got hurt, they would go to Vaitai ahead of Mailata, right?
Correct. Okay. Yeah. Vaitai's going to be the game day swing tackle. Mailata's not even going to dress on game days. Now, if he continues to improve, he's a tremendous prospect. He's way ahead of where the Eagles thought he was going to be. And I think a lot of it is what people say is a lot of college offensive linemen develop bad habits, and it's tough to break them. And they've been teaching Mailata from the ground up. So he doesn't have any real bad habits, and people look at that as a big positive. And I kind of understand that sentiment, but he's a long way away from being Jason Peters, which he will admit. I mean, we asked Jordan, we gave him Ross Tucker's quote after the Jets preseason game, and Jordan, by the way, has a tremendous personality, and he said, "What's he drinking?" It's unfair to the kid.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. And, of course, follow him on Twitter at JFMcMullen. We'll have plenty more as the Eagles get ready for the Atlanta Falcons. By the way, John, I mean, it's not a must-win game, but, hey, you get beat in this game, home field advantage becomes another, a definitely interesting scenario, because you would imagine that Atlanta's going to be in the mix.
Yeah, Atlanta's a very good team. Atlanta's one of those teams you could look at their roster and say they probably have Super Bowl talent, Super Bowl level talent, if everything goes correctly. So, yeah, I mean, every game's meaningful in the NFL, and if you can project down the line and say if the Eagles are fighting with the Falcons for home field advantage, obviously whoever wins this game, that would loom large. So you never say week one is must win or anything like that. But in this league where there's such a small sample size and you're playing another potential playoff team in your own conference,
yep,
that's big.
No doubt. I agree with you there. Sports Bash Live. John's back tomorrow. Appreciate it, pal.
Hey, thank you, guys.